Section 4.4, Factoring Quadratic Expressions. So factoring is where we are going to rewrite an expression as the product of its factors. So we are first going to look at factoring when we are given standard form and when a is going to be positive or negative 1. So let's look at our first example. We have x squared plus 14x plus 40. So we are looking for numbers that multiply to 40, but also add to 14. So some of you may need to come over here and make a table of values, okay? And so you could start with 1 times 40, 2 times 20, and you're looking for numbers that multiply to 40 but add to 14. So 3 doesn't go into it, but 4 times 10 does, okay? And if you think about it, 4 plus 10 gives me 14. So all what I do is I write x plus 4, x plus 10, okay? I knew they both had to be positive because positive 4 times positive 10 gave me positive 40, and then 4 plus 10, adds to positive 14. And that's your answer. That would be it factored. Press pause, and I want you to factor x squared minus 11x plus 30. So again, we're looking for numbers that multiply to 30, but add this time to negative 11, okay? So if you need to make your table of values, go for it. A lot of you guys are going to be able to think in your head what multiplies to a positive 30, but adds to a negative number. So you know that it's going to be 6 and 5 because those are the only numbers that are going to give you 11. But for them to add to negative 11, they would both have to be negative, and negative 6 times negative 5 is going to give you a positive 30. You can always check these problems by foiling those two factors back out, and if it doesn't give you x squared minus 11x plus 30, you probably made a mistake somewhere. In example 3, this problem is a little different. If you notice this time, a is negative 1. So when a is negative 1, your first step is going to be to factor out that negative 1, which is going to change all of your signs. So positive x squared, negative 14x, negative 32. After you factor out that negative 1, you can go ahead and you can think what multiplies to negative 32, but adds to 14. So I know that it's going to be 16 and 2, because 16 times 2 is 32. But then for it to add to negative 14, the 16 needs to be negative, and the 2 needs to be positive. And then all you're going to do is you're going to bring down the negative 1 or just the negative sign. Again, if you need to, make a table of values to use all of the numbers that multiply to 32 to find the one that's going to add to negative 14. The greatest common factor is going to be a common factor between each term, and then you need to make sure that you are talking about the highest factor from each term. Let's look at an example that causes us to find common factors before we are going to start factoring. So in example 4, we have 9x squared plus 9x minus 18. Okay, so you need to think of each term. What does 9x squared, 9x, and negative 18 have in common? Okay, I know that they all have 3 in common, but the highest one is going to be 9. So when I factor out a 9, that leaves me with x squared plus x and then minus 2. After we factor out the common factor, now we can factor some more. So I'm looking for what multiplies to negative 2, but adds to positive 1. Okay, so there's not a lot of numbers that multiply to 2. It's just 2 and 1. So now we just need to determine which one is going to be positive and which one is going to be negative. So if you notice, the middle term is positive 1. So I know my greatest term needs to be positive, and then minus 1. And then check, 2 times negative 1 gives me negative 2, and 2 minus 1 gives me positive 1. And then your last step is to just bring down the 9 out in front, and that's how you factor it. In example 5, press pause and I want you to factor 4x squared plus 8x plus 12. The first thing we want to check for is a greatest common factor. So, what is the greatest common factor between 4x squared, 8x, and 12? So they have 4 in common, so that leaves me with x squared plus 2x plus 3. Now you need to ask yourself what multiplies to positive 3, but adds to positive 2. So again, this one should be easy because there are only two numbers that multiply to 3. So it's positive 3 and positive 1. The only way, though, I am going to get to 2 is if 3 is positive and 1 is negative. But at this point in time, you always need to check. Positive 3 times negative 1 gives me negative 3, which is not positive 3. So I actually cannot factor this problem anymore. And up here is my answer. There's nothing that multiplies to positive 3 that is going to add to positive 2. So my answer is 4 times the quantity x squared plus 2x plus 3. Example 6, I have 7n squared minus 21n. So I am trying to look for the greatest common factor. So what does 7n squared have in common with negative 21n? So I hope that you notice that they both have a 7 in common, but also notice that they both have n, so the greatest common factor between the two of them is just going to be n, because this second term right here does not have a squared for me to factor out an n squared. So that leaves me with just n, and then when I factor out a 7n from negative 21, that leaves me with minus 3. And that's how you factor 7n squared minus 21n. Now let's look at factoring something from standard form when a isn't 1 or negative 1. Okay, when that happens, we are going to factor by grouping. So let me show you our first example. It's 4x squared plus 7x plus 3. So again, if you notice, a is not 1 or negative 1, so we have to do something different first, okay? So we have to take what a is, and we have to multiply it by c. So 4 times 3 gives me positive 12. And then I take my b term, which is 7. So now I am looking for numbers that multiply to positive 12, but add to 7. So what are two numbers that multiply to 12, but add to 7? So 4 times 3 gives me 12, and 4 plus 3 gives me 7. So you take your first term, and you bring down your 4x squared. Now, instead of bringing down my 7x, I am going to replace it with what I got over here as my factors, 4 and 3. So there's not a rhyme or a reason for writing the 4 first or the 3 first, but if you notice, this is a 4, so I'm going to write my 4 term first. So I'm going to write plus 4x plus 3x, and then you take your 3 and you bring it down. Okay, so again, 4x plus 3x comes back and replaces your 7x. Okay, so now that you have 4 terms, you are going to draw a line down the middle of it, and you are only going to look at the left-hand side. So what is the greatest common factor between 4x squared and 4x? So they have a 4 in common, they also have an x in common, so that leaves me with x plus 1, not plus 0. So now whatever this sign is, bring it down, so we're going to bring down the plus sign. Now what does 3x and 3 have in common? 3, which also leaves you with x plus 1. So now if you're factoring by grouping and those two parentheses are not the same thing, you've done something wrong. So since they both have x plus 1 in common, we are going to factor out an x plus 1, which is going to leave me with 4x plus 3 in my other parentheses. And that's how you factor 4x squared plus 7x plus 3. Press pause and factor 2x squared minus 7x plus 6. Since a is not 1 or negative 1, I have to multiply a times c. So 2 times 6 gives me 12. And then it needs to add to b, so -7. So I'm looking for numbers that multiply to 12, but add to -7. So in this scenario, it's going to be -3 times -4 gives me +12. And then -3 plus -4 gives me -7. So again, bring down the 2x squared. Now I'm going to replace my -7x with my two factors, the -3 and the -4. So if you notice, I have a 2 here, so it would be smart to write the other even number, the -4 next. So I'm going to write -4x and then -3x, and then you have to bring down the +6. If you wrote it in a different order, you would still get the same answer. Your factors would just be different. So draw a line down the middle of it. What does 2x squared and 4x have in common? 2x, which leaves me with x minus 2. Bring down the minus sign. So what does 3x and 6 have in common? A 3. So that leaves me with x. Now take this into consideration. 6 divided by -3 is going to give me a -2. So make sure your two parentheses are the same. They are. Factor out an x minus 2, which leaves you with 2x minus 3. And that's how you factor 2x squared minus 7x plus 6. Next, we are going to look at two different cases when factoring. So the first one is perfect square trinomials. So if you are given a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, that is going to factor to a plus b quantity squared. If you are given a squared minus 2 times a times b plus b squared, then that is going to factor to a minus b quantity squared, okay? So this is easier than you think. You're going to take the square root of the first term, which gives you your a over here, and then you're going to take the square root of the last term, which gives you your b over here, and then whatever sign is in the middle is what sign that goes in between your a and your b, and you put parentheses around it and you square it. The only thing you need to take into consideration is to make sure that the middle is actually 2 times the square root of the first term times the square root of the last term, okay? Otherwise, it's not going to be a perfect square trinomial. So let's look at example 9. So I give you 64x squared minus 16x plus 1. So, can I take the square root of 64x squared? Yes, it gives me 8x. Can I take the square root of 1? Yes, it gives me 1. So now I would check. 8 times 1 is 8, but remember this middle term is also by 2. So 8 times 1 is 8, times 2 gives me 16. So this is a perfect square trinomial. All you do is bring down that minus sign, put parentheses around it, and square it. And that's how you factor 64x squared minus 16x plus 1. Press pause and factor 9x squared plus 24x plus 16. So can we take the square root of the first term? What's the square root of 9x squared? It gives me 3x. Can I take the square root of the last term? Yes, it gives me 4. Okay, so now let's check. 3 times 4 gives me 12, and then times 2 equals 24. So it is a perfect square trinomial. Now all we have to do is bring down this sign that's in the middle, the plus sign, put parentheses around it, and square it. And that's how you factor 9x squared plus 24x plus 16. The last special case is a difference of two squares. And this is a squared minus b squared equals a plus b times a minus b. So something for you to notice. If this sign in the middle is not a minus sign, you cannot do this shortcut. Has to be a minus sign. And then if you notice, you just take the square root of the first term, take the square root of the last term, place them in your parentheses. One of them gets a plus sign, the other one gets a minus sign. The reason one of them has to have a plus and the other one has to have a minus is that's the only way it's going to get rid of that middle linear term that you're given. So let's look at example 11. So in example 11, I give you 16x squared minus 81. So I have two terms, good. In the middle is a minus sign, so it's probably going to be a difference of two squares. So let's take the square root of 16x squared, and that gives me 4x. Take the square root of 81, and that gives me 9. One of them is going to get a minus sign. The other one gets a plus sign. And that's how you factor 16x squared and minus 81. Press pause and factor 25x squared minus 4. So I'm given two terms. In the middle is a minus sign, so it's probably a difference of two squares. The square root of 25x squared is 5x. The square root of 4 is 2. It doesn't matter whether the plus sign or the minus sign comes first. Just make sure you're writing two factors. One of them has a plus sign in the middle of it. The other one is getting a minus sign in the middle of it. Again, you can check all of your answers by foiling to make sure it goes back to the original problem that you were given. I would highly recommend doing that if you're given a quiz or a test because you want to check your work before you turn it in.